Have you ever had an enemy who became a friend? Well, if you're a little boy or girl, hopefully you've never had any enemies, but I want to tell you about two men who absolutely hated each other, who ended up becoming very best friends. It's an amazing story. If your parents have ever told you the story about the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December the 7th, 1941, there was a group of Japanese planes that flew over and made a surprise attack on one of the Navy bases, military bases of the United States, and killed a lot of people and destroyed many of the planes and sunk some ships. And it was a terrible, terrible thing. Well, that particular attack was planned and led by a Japanese military genius whose name was Mitsuo Fuchida. Now, that's kind of a strange name for us to hear, but that was his name, Mitsuo Fuchida. And of course, as soon as people found out who it was and who he was, and it became clear that this was the man who had led the attack, everybody in America just had an anger and a hatred for this Japanese serviceman who had planned and led the attack on our military base. Well, as the war progressed, that, by the way, that's what launched us into World War II. And as the war progressed, an American serviceman named Jacob Deshazer was captured by the Japanese and was put into a prisoner of war camp, and there he was mistreated horribly. And he every day just built up such a hatred for the Japanese. And he said, if I ever survive and get out of here, I'm going to try to get even with every Japanese that I know. And if I could ever meet Mitsuo Fuchida, I would choke him to death with my own hands. Well, he was in that prison camp for almost 3 years. And one day, one of the Japanese guards, for some reason or another, smuggled in a little New Testament and gave it to Jacob Deshazer. And Jacob Deshazer began to read that New Testament. And he read the story of Jesus. And when he came to the place in that story where they were crucifying Jesus, and Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." He said it was like God spoke right to his heart and said, you need to receive my forgiveness, and then you need to forgive these Japanese guards who are beating you and mistreating you. And that's exactly what he did. Isn't that amazing? He prayed that night and said, Jesus, I believe that you died for me and that I was as cruel to you as these guards are to me. And so as soon as he became a believer, he said that suddenly he was just flooded with the love of Jesus. And he loved the guards that he had hated before. Now, I know that sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? But he tells the story, and you can find his story if you go online or if you get a book about his life. And when he finally, and by the way, he said he began to pray for his guards, and he just would tell them that he loved them. And they didn't know what to do with that. He said they would come in and beat him and kick him, and he would get up and say, I love you, and God loves you. And finally, he was released. The war was over, and he was able to get out. And like so many of the prisoners, he just barely survived. But when he got out, he said, they asked him, what do you want to do? He said, I want to tell everybody in the world about God's love and about the forgiveness that they can have through Jesus. And so he wrote a little gospel tract, a little story, a little booklet, and it was called The American Soldier Who Loves the Japanese. And he went back to Japan after the war was over, and he began to go around and tell people about Jesus. And one day, while he was on one part of town, Mitsuo Fuchida, who had survived the war, even though he had been wounded, he had survived the war. He found on the street this little booklet about this American soldier who loved the Japanese people. And he read that booklet, and he read in it about Jesus, who loved him and had died for him. And he became a Christian too. And he said, I want to meet Jacob Deshazer. And it's too long a story to tell all of it, but the bottom line is they did meet. And when they met, here was the man that Jacob Deshazer had said, if I ever meet him, I will choke him. But he didn't choke him. As a matter of fact, he bowed to him, and then he embraced him. And they both now, as Christian brothers, said, what can we do to help bring about peace and bring about reconciliation? And so they began to travel together in Japan, and then also later in America. And they began to preach to stadiums filled with people about the love of God, the forgiveness that we can have, and the forgiveness we can give to others. And so it was a great story. And the Bible tells us that Jesus came to reconcile men to himself, but also to reconcile men to one another. And I don't know of any story that demonstrates that any more than the story of Mitsuo Fuchida and Jacob Deshazer.